Chapter 1. The Calm Before the Storm. What if the woman sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom held a secret that could unravel an entire trial? What if beneath her unassuming exterior burned a fire forged by years of facing down threats most could only imagine? Sasha Carter sat in the dimly lit chambers of Cook County Courthouse in Chicago, her fingers brushing the edge of a badge hidden inside her navy blazer. 12 years as a United States Secret Service agent had taught her to mask her emotions, to wait for the perfect moment to strike. Today, though, wasn't about protecting a president or foiling a conspiracy. It was about saving her little brother, Jamal, from a system that seemed hell-bent on crushing him. The air in courtroom 4C hung heavy with the murmur of restless spectators and the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Sasha's dark eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail with the precision of a trained operative, the bailiff's subtle smirk as he glanced at Jamal, the prosecutor's polished shoes clicking confidently against the marble floor, and the judge's silver hair glinting under the morning sun streaming through tall, arched windows. Judge Harold Grayson presided over the bench like a king on a throne, his reputation for iron-fisted rulings well known in Chicago's legal circles, especially when it came to defendants who looked like Jamal. Jamal Carter sat at the defendant's table, his broad shoulders hunched slightly under the weight of a gray suit that didn't quite fit. At 26, he was 6 years younger than Sasha, but the lines on his face told a story of a life spent navigating a world that judged him before he even spoke. He'd been pulled over 3 months ago for a routine traffic stop that turned into a nightmare, dragged from his car, beaten, and charged with resisting arrest. The evidence, a grainy body cam video, painted a different picture, one Sasha had studied frame by frame until her eyes ached. She knew the truth. Jamal hadn't resisted. He'd complied, hands raised, voice steady, until the officer decided compliance wasn't enough. "Your brother's got a mouth on him, doesn't he?" the bailiff muttered to a clerk nearby, loud enough for Sasha to hear. She clenched her jaw, interlacing her fingers to keep them from curling into fists. The casual dismissal in his tone wasn't new to her. She'd heard it 1,000 times growing up on Chicago's South Side, teachers calling Jamal trouble for asking questions, neighbors whispering about those kids when they walked home from school. Even now, in a courthouse meant to uphold justice, the staff treated him like a stereotype instead of a man. "Mr. Carter," they called the white defendants earlier that morning, their voices dripping with respect. For Jamal, it was, "Boy," or, "You there," as if his name didn't matter. The prosecutor, a wiry man named Daniel Pierce, paced before the bench, his voice smooth and rehearsed. "The evidence is clear, Your Honor. Jamal Carter's actions during the traffic stop demonstrate a blatant disregard for authority. His prior record, a juvenile citation for loitering, only reinforces a pattern of defiance." Sasha's stomach twisted. That record was from when Jamal was 15, caught hanging out with friends on a street corner after curfew. A slap on the wrist for most kids, but for a black teenager in a neighborhood policed like an occupied territory, it became a scarlet letter. Judge Grayson leaned forward, his steel gray eyes narrowing as he waved a hand at Jamal's public defender, a young man named Kevin Tate who looked barely out of law school. "Let's see this video you keep harping on about," Grayson drawled, his tone dripping with impatience. The screen flickered to life, showing the shaky footage. Jamal's car pulled to the side of a quiet road, the officer barking orders, Jamal stepping out with his hands up. Then the escalation, shoves, shouts, a fist flying as Jamal stumbled backward. Sasha's breath caught. She'd watched it dozens of times, but seeing it here, projected for all to judge, reignited the fire in her chest. Tate stammered, adjusting his tie nervously. "Your Honor, the footage clearly shows my client complied with the officer's commands. There's no evidence of resistance." "Enough," Grayson snapped, cutting him off mid-sentence. "I've seen plenty. Unless you've got something concrete to add, we're moving on." He didn't even glance at the screen again, his dismissal as sharp as a gavel strike. Sasha's fingers tightened around the badge in her pocket, its cool metal grounding her. Not yet, she told herself. Not yet. The morning wore on, and Sasha watched the subtle biases pile up like bricks in a wall. When a white defendant had taken the stand earlier, charged with a DUI. Grayson listened patiently, nodding as the man rambled about one bad night. Jamal's turn came, and the judge barely looked up from his notes, tapping his pen as if counting the seconds until he could rule. The bailed-out businessman got, "Sir." Jamal got a curt, "Speak up." "Boy." Pierce, meanwhile, leaned hard into buzzwords, aggressive posture, non-compliant attitude, terms Sasha knew were code for the unspoken assumption that a black man's very presence was a threat. She thought back to her own career, the countless times she'd walked into a room of Secret Service agents, mostly white, mostly male, and felt their eyes linger a beat too long, questioning how she'd made it there. The supervisor who'd once joked she must have aced the physical test because she was built for it. The dignitary who assumed she was the assistant, not the lead agent. Sasha had climbed the ranks anyway, her record spotless, her resolve unbreakable. But watching Jamal now, she realized the system didn't just doubt people like them, it actively worked to bury them. Grayson's voice jolted her from her thoughts. "You, in the back," he said, fixing his gaze on Sasha. The room turned to look, a ripple of curiosity breaking the monotony. "You've been awfully quiet, Missy. Got an opinion you'd like to share with the court?" His lips curled into a smirk, the kind that dared her to step out of line. Sasha rose slowly, her heart pounding but her face a mask of calm. Every eye tracked her movement, the air thickening with unspoken tension. She could feel Jamal watching her, his trust a silent anchor. This wasn't the moment to reveal her hand, not fully, but she wouldn't let Grayson's arrogance go unanswered. "I'm just here to observe, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, carrying the quiet authority she'd honed over years of high-stakes missions. "But I do find it interesting how quickly conclusions are drawn in this room." The smirk faltered, just for a second, before Grayson waved her off. "Sit down and let the professionals handle this." Sasha complied, but as she settled back into her seat, her mind raced. She'd seen the cracks in their case, Pierce's exaggerations, the video's truth, Grayson's bias. All she needed was the right moment to turn their assumptions into their undoing. For Jamal, she'd wait as long as it took. Chapter 2. The Mask Falls. The courtroom buzzed with the low hum of anticipation as the prosecution prepared to tighten the noose around Jamal's neck. Sasha Carter sat ramrod straight, her hands resting lightly on her lap, though every nerve in her body thrummed with the instinct to act. 12 years in the Secret Service had honed her ability to read a room, every glance, every shift in posture, and right now, Courtroom 4C was a battlefield of unspoken biases and calculated moves. She watched Prosecutor Daniel Pierce strut before the bench, his voice oily with confidence as he played the body cam footage again. This time with a narrative twisted to fit his agenda. "Notice the defendant's hands, Your Honor," Pierce said, pausing the video on a frame where Jamal's arms were raised. "This isn't compliance, it's a threatening gesture. A clear sign of resistance." Sasha's eyes narrowed. She'd dissected that footage until she could recite every second. Jamal had lifted his hands to steady himself after being yanked from the car. Not to threaten. Pierce was banking on the jury seeing what he wanted them to see, a dangerous black man defying authority, rather than the truth. The jury, a mix of 12 Chicagoans, shifted in their seats. Sasha caught the whispers from 2 white jurors in the front row. Their heads tilted toward each other as they eyed Jamal. "He looks like he could snap," one murmured, just loud enough for her to hear. The other nodded, lips pursed. She'd seen that look before, on the faces of civilians who crossed the street when she walked by in civilian clothes. On the TSA agent who, randomly, searched her bag despite her federal credentials. It was the quiet, pervasive assumption that blackness equaled menace. No evidence required. Judge Harold Grayson leaned back in his chair, his expression a mask of boredom tinged with disdain. "Let's hear from the officer." "Then," he said, waving a hand. The prosecution called Officer Ryan Callahan to the stand, a stocky man with a buzz cut and a swagger that matched Pierce's. He settled into the witness box, his blue eyes flicking briefly to Jamal before settling on the jury. "Mr. Carter refused to follow orders," Callahan said, his voice steady but laced with a rehearsed edge. "I told him to exit the vehicle, and he got belligerent, raised his hands like he was ready to fight." I had no choice but to subdue him. Sasha's fingers twitched against her blazer, brushing the badge hidden inside. Subdue him. She'd seen the bruises on Jamal's ribs, the split lip he'd nursed for weeks. Callahan's subduing had been a beatdown. Plain and simple. Jamal's public defender, Kevin Tate, rose shakily to cross-examine. Officer Callahan, the video shows my client stepping out of the car with his hands up. Can you explain how that constitutes belligerence? Callahan shrugged, a smirk tugging at his lips. You weren't there. I felt threatened. That's what matters. Tate fumbled with his notes. But the footage. Enough. Grayson interrupted, his gavel tapping lightly. I've heard plenty from you. Counselor, sit down. The dismissal was sharp, and Sasha's chest tightened. Tate's inexperience was a liability, but Grayson's impatience was a weapon, one he wielded freely against Jamal. The gallery stirred, a few spectators whispering as Pierce called his next witness. Sasha's gaze shifted to the jury again. A middle-aged white woman in the back row scribbled something in a notebook, her lips tight. Earlier that day, during a white defendant's hearing, she'd smiled warmly as he explained his mistake. Now, her eyes barely met Jamal's. Sasha knew that look, judgment dressed up as objectivity. It was the same look she'd gotten from a field supervisor years ago, who'd questioned her promotion despite her perfect scores, muttering about quotas under his breath. Pierce wrapped up his case with a flourish, turning to the jury. This isn't about one traffic stop, it's about a pattern. Jamal Carter doesn't respect authority. And that night, he proved it. He sat down, smug satisfaction radiating from him. Grayson nodded, then turned to Tate. Defense. Anything to add, or are we done here? Tate stood, his voice trembling. Your Honor, the video clearly contradicts. Grayson cut him off again. I said substantive, not repetition. If that's all, we'll move to closing. His eyes swept the room, landing on Sasha. And you, back there, still observing. I take it, maybe you should leave if you've got nothing to contribute. The smirk returned, a challenge wrapped in condescension. Sasha felt the moment crystallize, the air in the room thickening as every eye turned to her. Her pulse quickened, but her training kicked in, steady breathing, clear focus. She rose slowly, her movements deliberate, and the rustle of her blazer seemed to echo in the silence. Jamal looked up at her, his dark eyes wide with a mix of fear and trust. She gave him the slightest nod, a promise she'd kept since they were kids. I've got you. Your Honor, she began, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. I'd be happy to contribute. Grayson's smirk widened, but Sasha's hand moved to her blazer, fingers slipping inside the pocket. She pulled out the badge, holding it aloft so the light caught the embossed seal of the United States Secret Service. 12 years with the U.S. Secret Service. Badge number 8192. I've spent my career analyzing threats and upholding justice. And I can assure you, what's happening here isn't justice. The courtroom erupted in gasps. Pierce's confident posture crumbled, his mouth falling open. Callahan shifted uncomfortably in the witness box, his swagger evaporating. The jury sat up straighter, their whispers silenced. Grayson's face flushed red, the smirk vanishing as if slapped off. What, Agent Carter? This is highly irregular, he sputtered, grasping for control. With respect, Your Honor, Sasha continued, her tone unshakable. I've reviewed the evidence with the precision I use to protect this nation's leaders. That body cam footage shows textbook escalation of force without cause. My brother complied, hands up, voice calm, until Officer Callahan turned a routine stop into an assault. The law doesn't bend for personal biases, no matter how deeply they're ingrained. Grayson slammed his gavel, the sound sharp but hollow. You don't have authority here, Agent Carter. This is my courtroom. Sasha met his gaze, unflinching. No, sir. Truth has the authority, and I'm making sure it's heard. The jury exchanged glances, several nodding faintly. She'd planted the seed, and it was taking root. Pierce leapt to his feet, stammering, This is outrageous. She can't just. Sit down, Mr. Pierce. Grayson snapped, though his voice wavered. He glared at Sasha, fury warring with uncertainty. You're out of line, Agent. Step back. Sasha lowered the badge but didn't sit. She'd shown her hand, and the room would never be the same. Jamal reached for her hand under the table, squeezing it tightly. In that touch, she felt his gratitude, his relief, and the weight of what came next. The battle wasn't over, but she'd just turned the tide. Chapter 3. Victory and Beyond. The silence in Courtroom 4C was deafening. A charged stillness that lingered after Sasha Carter's revelation. Her Secret Service badge rested in her hand, a gleaming symbol of authority that had turned Judge Harold Grayson's smug certainty into a flicker of doubt. Sasha stood tall, her gaze locked on the bench, while the jury watched her with a mix of awe and curiosity. She'd stripped away the mask of impartiality the prosecution had worn, exposing the raw truth beneath. Jamal wasn't the threat here, the system was. Grayson cleared his throat, his face still flushed as he tried to regain control. Agent Carter, your credentials are noted, but this isn't a federal case. You're here as a spectator, not counsel. His voice strained, caught between indignation and unease. Sasha inclined her head slightly, a gesture of respect that carried no surrender. Understood, Your Honor. I'm simply ensuring the facts aren't buried. She sat down, her presence a quiet storm that refused to dissipate. Kevin Tate, bolstered by Sasha's intervention, seized the moment. Your Honor, I'd like to call Agent Carter as a character witness, he said, his voice steadier now. Grayson's jaw tightened, but he waved a reluctant hand. Proceed, but keep it brief. Sasha took the stand, swearing the oath with the same calm authority she'd brought to countless security briefings. Tate asked, Agent Carter, based on your experience, how would you assess the incident involving your brother? She leaned forward, addressing the jury directly. In 12 years with the Secret Service, I've learned that true threats don't hide in raised hands or a raised voice. They hide in escalation without cause. That video shows an officer turning compliance into conflict. Jamal didn't resist, he reacted, as any civilian would, to unprovoked force. I've seen this pattern before, not just in my work, but in my life. The system often labels people like us dangerous before the evidence is even weighed. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. She thought of the times she'd been tailed by police while driving home from a shift. The way her badge didn't always shield her from suspicion. Justice isn't blind, she continued. It's human, and humans can choose to see truth or cling to prejudice. The jury listened, rapt, several nodding as her expertise lent weight to Tate's shaky defense. Pierce objected, his voice shrill. This is irrelevant. She's not a legal expert. Grayson hesitated, then overruled. She's testifying to character and context. I'll allow it. His tone was grudging, but Sasha saw the shift. The jury was hers now. Closing arguments came swiftly. Pierce doubled down, painting Jamal as a habitual offender. But his words rang hollow after Sasha's testimony. Tate, newfound confidence in his stride, urged the jury to trust the evidence, not assumptions. Then came the wait, 3 agonizing hours of deliberation. Sasha sat beside Jamal, her hand resting on his. You were incredible, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. She smiled faintly. We're not done yet. When the jury returned, the forewoman, a black woman with a steady gaze, stood. We find the defendant, Jamal Carter, not guilty. The gallery erupted, gasps and murmurs rippling through the crowd. Jamal's shoulders shook as he pulled Sasha into a fierce hug, tears streaking his face. You're my superhero, Sash, he said, voice breaking. She held him tight, her own eyes burning. She'd guarded presidents and dignitaries. But this was her proudest mission. Grayson banged his gavel, dismissing the case with a scowl. As the room emptied, reporters swarmed outside, cameras flashing. A white journalist shoved a microphone in Sasha's face. How'd someone like you end up in the Secret Service? He asked, his tone dripping with disbelief. Sasha paused, then smiled coolly. Hard work and a refusal to let people like you define me. She guided Jamal through the throng, her posture as steady as ever. Pierce lingered by the courthouse steps, muttering to a colleague, she's just a government hotshot with a chip on her shoulder. Sasha overheard but didn't flinch. She'd faced worse dismissals and come out stronger every time. 6 months later, Sasha stood at a podium in a South Side community center, her badge gleaming under the lights. The room was packed, law enforcement trainees, activists, and local kids. all drawn by the story of the agent who'd taken on a judge and won. Jamal sat in the front row, grinning as he watched his sister speak. He'd started a mentorship program for at-risk youth, teaching them how to navigate a world that too often saw them as threats. "That courtroom taught me something," Sasha said, her voice carrying to every corner. "Justice isn't just about protecting the powerful, it's about shielding the vulnerable from a system that's rigged against them. I've guarded leaders, but standing between my brother and injustice showed me what protection really means." She paused, her gaze sweeping the crowd. "We're all guards of justice. In our own way. It takes patience, precision, and the courage to act when the time is right." A teenager in the back raised his hand. "How do you keep going when they treat you like you don't belong?" Sasha's mind flashed to the supervisor who'd doubted her, the journalist who'd questioned her, the countless small cuts of bias she'd endured. "You prove them wrong," she said, not with anger, but with excellence. "They'll underestimate you, let them. It's their weakness, not yours." After the talk, Jamal joined her at the podium, his smile wide. "I'm proud of you, sis, and I'm gonna make sure these kids don't end up where I did." Sasha nodded, her hand resting on his shoulder. She'd begun to question her future with the Secret Service, not because she doubted her purpose, but because she saw a bigger fight ahead, reforming the systems that failed people like Jamal every day. As they left the center, Sasha fingered the worn edge of her badge, its weight a reminder of the day she turned Grayson's prejudice into his defeat. Victory in that courtroom had rippled outward, touching lives she'd never imagined. She looked at Jamal, now a beacon for others, and felt a quiet certainty settle in her chest. Justice wasn't a gift handed down, it was a fire kindled by those brave enough to stand up. The Chicago skyline loomed against the dusk, a city of contrasts where shadows hid both danger and hope. Sasha knew the road ahead was long, but she'd walked tougher paths before. Sometimes, she thought, the biggest changes start with one voice refusing to stay silent, one badge shining in the dark.